Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So I watched a clip from Roland Martin. He goes on this thing about identity politics. Apparently Bill Maher was in an interview. Bill Maher mentioned that Democrats need to get away from identity politics. Bill Maher is right. They should get away from identity politics. Now, he's trying to explain why he thinks Bill Maher should go fuck himself. He didn't say it that way, but that's essentially what's going on. He's explaining in this way of saying, well, look, anytime they say something about identity politics, they're talking about black stuff. It's like, hey, hush up with that black stuff. And he's tying it to Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and all these other events. I can agree with him that the construction events, all those things, I absolutely agree with him on that. And yes, when they're talking about it, they're talking about black stuff, but that's a subset. I mean, identity politics is not just black stuff. Like, it's not, this only pertains to African Americans. He's talking about any particular subgroup. So if you're talking about blacks, gays, Asians, Hispanics, whatever, all of these issues, for the most part, end up with this component of respect my identity. Now, there's a difference between going into arguments about identity and to going into arguments of things that are practiced into law. Meaning you can come in contact with an injustice in a particular system. For instance, you can say, well, look, pot or blacks are arrested 4 times more even though they use the same drugs to the same degree. That's a structural issue. You can call it a racist structural issue, fair enough, but that's a structural issue. That's an issue to be fixed. But you can't make a social justice argument about it because you're not going to get those people to agree with you. That's a no-win argument. You're having a conversation with a guy who hates you. What are you going to say to him to make you not hate you? What you do have commonality with that guy, even though he may be completely unreasonable on other points. His wallet is a little bit more, put it this way, you have far more in common with that guy with economics than you would ever have with identity. And you are never going to get a situation where you're going to make somebody like you based on arguing with those people. Facts don't matter in those particular arguments. It doesn't matter. Those things becomes issues of perspective. I don't like this particular thing because I've assigned a bunch of stuff to it. Yes, the stuff that that person assigned to whatever that demographic is that he doesn't particularly like or he has a particular view of. Yes, it may be gross. So what? He's a person. He can be gross if he wants to be gross. The issue is not necessarily what he thinks. It's what he does. And if we're talking about having this conversation about identity politics, you are never going to get him to agree with you. You're never going to get him to agree with you. He has an idea, a fantasy idea of what this country is. And having a fantasy idea of what this country is, that breeds certain biases within him. Meaning the things that you're saying to him, even though the things that you may be saying are true in regards to you, your culture, why his ideas are wrong, why his ideas are somewhat corrupted and turned. Yeah, you can have the conversation. But he has his own reality box that all that stuff is being filtered through. A person, an individual, is changed by the events that they go through, not necessarily the conversations that they're going to have. Meaning you can never get him to that place through conversation. That place is gotten there by experience, if that makes sense. So having this argument about identity doesn't get you anywhere. Let's talk about policy. Let's talk about the things that affect all of us. If that guy is a free guy, let's say you're in a different society and those people were free. Are you telling me that that guy is not free to dislike you? Even if that dislike is wrong. And should you even care that that guy dislikes you? I don't give a shit if he dislikes me. Just don't fuck me when you go to the polls. That's why Sanders, and if you want to say Bill Maher, that's why they emphasize economics. They emphasize issues that don't necessarily relate to identity. I get it. As an African American, I understand. I get this. Ultimately, you're put into a country unfairly. You brought here against your will. You didn't want to be here. You built this country, literally, brick by brick, under a lash. And for that, you got no compensation. You did it for free. The labor, the place, the wealth of this particular country, in many respects, was derived from the ability to get cheap labor or free labor. Who built this country? So I understand what Roland Martin is saying when he's saying, look, this level of oppression going from slavery for hundreds of years, then from that going into situations of structural racism, meaning whether it was the cops, whether it was trying to get a house, whether it was trying to find somewhere to live or a particular community, even the perspective of that community with regards to the individual. I get it. I understand it. I understand your perspective. I understand where it comes from. You get to the 60s and you have a movement of saying, hey, I am a man. I am a man, goddammit. You cannot treat me a particular way. And those people suffered and got those particular rights and got those people to change the way society views people to that degree. It was organic. It happened somewhat naturally, even though it was somewhat traumatic, at least for the country's sake. This country does not have a fair representation of itself. It doesn't have a fair conception of itself. It was built on a genocide. It followed up that particular genocide by enslaving a generation and taking a man and mutilating him into a slave, after which point a Negro. What I'm trying to get at is the perspective of the individual who goes through that. That is traumatic. And yes, those people didn't necessarily live through it, but it doesn't necessarily matter. There's a cultural memory, and everything that takes place now has some vestiges in what took place then. Meaning if you're going to spend 400 years building something for somebody else and get no compensation, being raped, tortured, beaten, mutilated, no compensation. And then at the point where you are fighting for your rights and you're getting some level of parity in that particular society, you're still barred from certain positions. You're still looked down upon. You're still pushed back on unfairly, which is the point. Even the viewpoint of the society, like I said, the society tries to justify the things that it does, meaning I can justify suppressing you in this way. I can justify treating you this way because you are lesser than. That's an amazing thing. So you can understand the context of a person who goes through that or has a cultural memory of that. Particularly when those things, there's some of those aspects that are still present in our current society. So yeah, I understand these groups have a chip on their shoulder. I would have a chip on my shoulder too. I understand the perspective. I am an African American. Hell, I'm an African American with a Native American heritage also. I get it on both sides. But you understand, I don't have this level of, this sounds bad, but I don't necessarily, look, I don't necessarily think Americans have this level of empathy in their way. Like, I don't necessarily think they have a fair conception of themselves to even get to that level of understanding the severity of what took place and how the momentum of that affects the current day and time. They don't have it in them. There's no way for me to communicate that to them. In fact, the very act of having this particular conversation will probably have them to recoil in terror. It is a heavy burden that they take on, that they try to get rid of and escape. And ultimately, the people who are in that particular society, who are victims of that, is a reminder. We have a tricky history. It's complicated. That being said, you're still together with those people. And ultimately, you're still trying to strive in that particular society. And yes, from the context of the things that took place, you can understand why somebody would be advocate for a particular position, meaning, yes, my identity matters because my identity was attacked for years on end, for decades. It was smeared. It was turned into something that I was not. So I get that, and I get needing to be strong on that point. But can you be strong on that point for specific issues that come up, while at the same token focusing on issues of economics that affects everybody? Because you need to realize that you're not going to get that particular perspective across as an identity issue to somebody who doesn't give a shit about your identity. You are 14% of the population. And yes, we have a complicated history, so I understand the context. And this is not just a black issue. This is Hispanic. This is gay. Whatever that demographic is, whatever that subgroup. If you're having conversations about people trying to get them to respect your identity, some may not. I'm making the point that the people who may not don't matter. It only matters when it becomes the issue of policy. Let people think what those people want to think. They come to their conclusions when they come to their conclusions. There is nothing you're going to say. If you're going to make that a political argument, you're going to lose that political argument. Not because what you're saying is wrong, but what you're saying has to be subjective because it's filtered through the lens of the person who you're having an argument with. That person doesn't see you that way. Not just that, that person doesn't even want to see you that way. That person doesn't give a shit about you. So yes, I understand. You want to be recognized and your identity wants to be affirmed. Fair enough. As long as you're not being impugned by law or some kind of societal thing, then you should focus on economics. I don't like this identity politics. And when I'm saying identity, I'm not talking about just race. I'm talking about race, gender, whatever. Those things are divisive. and ultimately unwinnable. It's like it's like you're throwing air at each other. My God can beat your God. Yeah, okay, I don't know what that means. Can I talk about the things that's going to affect my wallet? Hey, can we talk about climate and green energy? Hey, can we even have a conversation about this goddamn economic system that allows poverty and creates scarcity? No. You want to talk about your race. You want to talk about your gender. You want to talk about something else. Yeah, dude, identity politics is a no-win situation. And yes, it does divide and it does alienate. Understand, some of this stuff is political grandstanding to a degree. And not for Roland. Roland's fine. I'm saying the identity stuff is played up. Some of it is intentional, some of it just happenstance. You had the civil rights movement. In that particular civil rights movement, the Democratic Party, for the most part, reached out to African Americans. Now, that became somewhat of a cultural memory because Republicans were running Southern strategy. When the Civil Rights Act passed, those racist people jumped into the Republican Party. So yes, there's going to be a cultural trend towards that the propensity for that. Yeah, there's a historical basis for that propensity for racism in that particular party. Now, let's say that pursues on for decades. And the views of those people have softened to a degree, but it's still through a particular cultural lens. Their families, the people they interact with, their friends, all those people, for the most part, are soaking in the same stew in the same way you're soaking in the same stew. They have certain preconceived ideas. Those ideas may be wrong. Your ideas may be wrong. It is what it is. The thing is, when something comes up, you're looking through your cultural lens, they're looking through their cultural lens. You have certain feelings about things that you ascribe as your identity, that you identify as yourself, as who you are, whether it's race, personhood, whatever. That particular person also has things in that particular sense, because that person, even being white, is a particular demographic. All demographics are relative to one another. Now, personally, I think the differences between you is probably minor. But yes, as human beings, we have the arrogance to find minor distinctions and make those things larger than what they are. I don't care what that guy thinks at all. What I care about is what he co-signs on. And if he feels alienated and he looks over at the Democratic Party and he sees all of these other races lined up in that particular party, certainly you can understand a certain amount of alienation from him coming from that particular context, looking at this particular context. And then on top of that, you have Republicans saying, hey, they just want to take your money and they want to give to those other people. Those other people are trying to take your money. You guys are the makers. You guys are the people who make shit. You're the good, strong, proud Americans. And those guys, those others, they're out there. And they want to raise your taxes to give to those others. So, yeah, they're political grandstanding and they're playing into their own biases. They don't realize that the majority of the people who own those services are white. We make up 13% of the population. And yet, because of certain ideas and cultural biases and certain things that they have roaming in their heads, they eat that line and they hurt themselves in the process. From that context, they feel alienated. Now you can say they shouldn't feel alienated. You can even say feeling alienated says something about that particular individual. What would that individual have to be to feel alienated about people because of race or multicultural or whatever else? That's fine. But do you need to accentuate it? You should only care about that stuff at the point where it's dealing with law. I don't need to have this conversation about whether or not they're shooting deer and whatever, wrestling alligators. I don't care. I don't care. I care about is when he goes to the polls, what is he voting on? And what is the reason he's pulling that vote? No, I don't want him to make a hate vote in that sense. I want him to vote his own self-interest. And if you give him something, enough difference, if you put something on the table that that guy can get behind and matters to him more than what he culturally thinks about these other people, then yes, you can get him. But you would never get him focusing on identity issues because he's never going to get your identity issues. And you can never win that argument. It is an absolute divisive policy or politics. It should be avoided. I understand what Roland Martin is saying. And I'm trying to give you the perspective of the individual and the group and why they get this title of social justice warriors. I think the title is somewhat unfair. I do think you need people to be adamant to affirm themselves. But affirming yourself is different than making a political argument coaxed around race or gender. The point. The only point. I don't care what's in their heads. Point. What is your life going to be like? What is your life going to be like? Let's talk about this particular economic system, because ultimately, There is no freedom without capital in a capitalistic society. So yes, these people can quibble about this stuff. That's fine. But the issue is the economics. You don't care about whether he hates you or not. He can hate you whatever he wants. That's his right. That's his choice. He's a being of choice. And if he chooses to dislike you, that's fine. But certainly you can understand having a conversation about something that's in his self-interest is a hell of a lot better than trying to get him to see you in a particular way. I don't like this identity politics. And what I'm saying there don't just mean, black stuff or race stuff. It's a recognition that you're not going to win that case. You can't win that case. That person evolves into a particular position, not because you're saying something to him about it. He doesn't, particularly under your argument, he wouldn't even view you as a person, per se. Or he views you as a person, he views you as something lesser. So what? How is he going to vote? And what are the reasons he's voting? And the issue that you need to do is make it a case of class, not race. It's class, not race. Just to put a finer point on this, just for the last point. This country is odd in a way. And in the same way that this tragedy of the origin of this country, like I said, it was genocide followed by enslavement, using that enslavement to build a country with no compensation for building that particular country. And then within years, turning around saying, oh yeah, we've done too much. You guys should be further along than this. That's the backdrop. Now, this thing of race, yes, it's contorted a man into something that a man shouldn't be. And in the process of contorting a man in that way, the person who contorted him also damaged himself. He damaged himself severely. So what I'm getting at is, yes, we suffered, but so did white Americans. Whether they realized it or not, they were causing a certain degree of their own suffering by creating the class distinction in that way. Meaning, I have my white skin. I may be uneducated. I may not have a dime in my name. I may be dirt poor, but I at least have my white skin. And goddamn, I don't have his. Now, in their minds, this is the issue of race. Society is structured around race. So, yes, in that particular caste, you view yourself as being better than, even if you have none of the attributes necessary to be better than. That particular person, who is a person, he's a man, and yet you've contorted him to a slave. The very act of you oppressing that particular person and seeing that person as lesser than took your eye off the ball of larger issues that affect you. Meaning that many of the people, those whites, suffered economically, brutally and economically, because they didn't quite understand that the issues that they were dealing with were not in issues of race, it was an issue of class. There's a difference in those things. So entire time, instead of you guys getting riled up in the sense of saying, wait a minute, we're being mistreated year after year, when you're talking about the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Yes, there was prosperity, but yes, there was also poverty. And the point that I'm getting at, the flow and momentum of this particular country giving more wealth, more and more wealth, at least the share of the wealth owned in the government or owned in the public, to the top 1%. The class distinction is the thing that matters. But because there was this thing of, well, there's always a bottom rung that I myself as a white man would never actually hit, it takes you out the ball. It takes you out the ball. It makes you feel like a middle class of sorts. Or it makes you feel like at times where you should be getting riled up because of injustices that are perpetrated upon you in the same way those things were perpetrated upon those slaves. You thought, well, I'm not that guy. I'm not a slave, at least. The stigma that persisted, even after that person was made a man again, he was made whole, at least under the law. He's no longer 3/5. We recognize him as a person. And as that persisted, for the most part, the society still had a particular image of that particular person that was negative. Because the image needed to make sense, or it needed to explain why his status was that particular way. It was society's way of trying to cleanse itself of this particular injustice. It didn't want to confront it, honestly. It never wants to confront it, honestly. So, you get to that particular point. Whites, in this case, because they were so focused in the sense of race. Like, our country evolved from this idea of that division of white and black due to the complicated history, slavery and whatnot. But it's almost as if, because that class is there, because they don't necessarily want to have the honest conversation of, okay, these are the things that we did. We need to face up to the things that we did, and we need to pay attention to those things. Because they don't want to have that particular honest conversation, it makes it somewhat difficult for themselves. I think that's what I'm trying to say. It's like they're eating themselves. They have this image of America that doesn't exist. It doesn't necessarily have the atrocities baked into it. It doesn't have the things that we do abroad in other countries baked into it. It is this fantasy country on a hill. That's their view of the country. Now, with that particular view of the country, if you're talking about some other demographic, yeah, their view of the country doesn't include the nasty stuff that happened to you, because in their mind, oh, that would happen back then. That doesn't happen to you. You should buck up. You should already be okay at this point. That's their view of the world. That's their view of the world. It's a short, small box. Now, because that's their view of the world, they're voting for people who ultimately, it's almost like a cultural thing, but the votes that they're making is literally hurting themselves. The majority of the people on social services are white. The majority of the people on welfare are white. These guys thinking in that particular cultural box that ultimately this American country, for the most part, is this shining city on the hill. They don't necessarily see these vagaries in the past. So when people come up saying, well, we need XYZ, some kind of service, some kind of social thing, they look at themselves and say, yes, I'm not giving those people anything. They got enough. They got enough. Not realizing that the people who were getting it was his own people. Was his own people. His cultural lens, just based on the way this came up, the way society kind of flowed from slave, Negro, African American, black, whatever, however you want to call it, as it moves through the grooves of relevance in a particular society. But he paid no attention to it. He just looked at that point of, well, everybody's an American and you should be okay, so you don't necessarily need any kind of help from us. That may not be true, but the very act of you being selfish is essentially injuring yourself. They're voting for people who are actively hurting their interests. It's an amazing phenomenon. I'm making this point that the phenomenon kind of raised that way, meaning if there was no slave in that society, would they have continued with some of the things that took place, and would they be okay with adding those particular services?
All right, folks, let me deal with this issue of identity politics. Now, we've heard a lot of folks, Senator Bernie Sanders, talking about this in the wake of Democrats losing in November. But Bill Maher was recently on CNN with Jake Tapper, and the issue came up, and here's what Bill, the uber liberal, had to say.
You said on your show that liberals need to stop trying to win over Trump voters with facts. So what should Democrats do to win over Trump voters?
Well, I was just going to say, a bit of it should be ease up on the identity politics. They pulled off quite a neat trick in 2016. They made white people, who are still the majority in this country, feel like a minority, or at least enough of them to swing the election. So I think that's important, to make sure you look like you represent everybody, including the majority. And also go where the energy is in the party. Hillary is a lovely lady, but she couldn't fill the function room at the Olive Garden, and there was a 74-year-old man who was getting crowds of 20,000 young people to come see him. Rallies matter.
All right, folks, let's sort of break this thing down. See, anytime you hear somebody bring up identity politics, okay, what they're really talking about is when you have groups out there who are fighting for rights, long ignored. If you go back to the Black freedom movement, some folks call it the civil rights movement, that's really when identity politics, well, that phrase really was coined, was established, because you had African Americans who were fighting for their rights. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, CORE, NAACP, National Urban League, the Big Six, National Congress of Negro Women, all of them were actually doing that.
Yeah, I have no idea what he's talking about. I don't understand why he believes that somebody talking about jobs is only talking about white people. I mean, when you're having this conversation about identity politics, it's not this lens. It's so very specific. It's like he's, so if I say jobs, it's like he's trying to be a decoder. It's like, I'm going to decode all of this jargon from Sanders and Bill Maher. When they're saying identity politics, they're saying they want to talk about this other, they don't want to talk about this black stuff. A, identity politics is not just about blacks. It's about all these, there are many demographics. B, can you have a conversation about things that don't necessarily overly emphasize identity? What I'm getting at is, you would never get that person to agree with you with identity. You won't. What that person believes of the world, they rise in a particular way. Now, the question becomes, is it okay for that person to believe a particular thing? Yes, they're a person. They can believe whatever they want. What gets us? What unites us? You have 10 people in a room. What unites us? We may look different. We may sound different. We may talk different. We may be from different places. We may have different political ideologies. We may even dislike certain aspects of the people in that particular group. But ultimately, everybody in that group wants to survive. Everybody in that group wants to live. This is rooted within our humanity, to excel and persist ourselves. In our particular capitalistic society, the root of that is cash. What you have in your pocket determines your degrees of freedom in this capitalistic model. The thing that you want to hit at is the thing that they require to persist. Cash. Economics. That's where you get your wins. And understand, you realize these people are progressives, meaning these issues that you're bringing up, once they get into office, it doesn't necessarily mean they're only going to focus on one particular thing. They're making a case that economics is the vehicle that gets you there, not identity. These issues that you're talking about, understand, I get it. Like, I get the perspective of it. And in no way does saying we're focusing on identity lessen the severity of those issues. I agree with you. But that's not going to get you elected. And ultimately, like I said, those 10 people sitting around, the one thing that those people agree with is, I need more money in my pocket. Those people are raping this particular country. Yes, we have agreement. Bob can hate my goddamn guts. He can spit on my grave when I die. But at the end of the day, Bob and I are working side by side in the sense of economics, and we're coding our decisions in economics. We can argue and bitch and complain about this other stuff. Fair enough, but we're arguing right now about economics. The social stuff will remain social. When issues come up that require a certain level of stance, then yes, we take that particular stance, but that stance doesn't necessarily have to be overly focused on identity. A white cop shoots a black guy in his back. Yes, you can look at that and say, well, look, that's some kind of racial issue that we need to deal with, and that's true. But the only vehicle you have for dealing with that is power, meaning government. And yes, you can call it out for what it is. That in no way hurts you. But if you're having a candidate, that candidate should be talking about those people's wallets. That's what I'm getting at. You can be aware of those issues. You can know those things exist. But your first job as a candidate, how do I get in a position to do those things? What is the argument that I make to get to do those things? How do I get elected? When that person gets elected and his supporters, and that guy gets in office, and you have a progressive in office, you don't think that that progressive is going to look at these issues that you're talking about and try to make adjustments on those issues? Nobody is saying that identity politics doesn't matter. Nobody's saying that. They're making a point that an over-reliance of it is divisive. It's divisive. It divides society. And it's not just a quote-unquote black issue. And when they're talking about workers, they're not talking about quote-unquote white workers. They're talking about workers. All of us. That's the point. We're in it together. I understand he's making this case of the minority thing, and I even agree with him on this to some degree. I can totally see that. This thing of we're losing power, we want to take our country back, all this stuff. Yeah, that's indicative of a certain level of resentment. But that resentment didn't get Trump elected. That resentment was a minority. And you still had a huge number of people who voted for Obama in 2008 or 2012, which somewhat guts this argument that the only reason these people were voting was because it was some craven reason. And that identity mattered in that process. Identity didn't matter in the process. I know what Trump was saying. I get it. He was being racist and everything else. But that's not what got him elected. The economic message got him elected. Your problem is, in this case, to make this argument, you can't explain why those people in 2008 and 2012 voted Obama then turned to Trump. Because it guts the argument that those people were racist in some way. Meaning your focus on identity and you bringing this stuff up as issues of identity needs to be on the center table. Why? Why? Those people who were voted for Trump weren't necessarily racist. You may have a base, but that base was always there. The issues that they were concerned about was economics. And that issue has nothing to do with whether you're black, white, or anything else. It has to do with all of us. It affects all of us. you get a commonality among all of us on an issue that deals with our root needs. Economics. Economics. I understand this idea of, there's specific issues that are coaxed in race or something like that. I get it. That's important. I'm not undermining the issue itself. I'm just saying that's not going to get you elected. And you're going to have a lot of people who are not going to see that particular issue your way, even though you're absolutely right in seeing it that particular way. I don't have... Look, this sounds bad, but I'm somewhat cynical in regards to how America is, or Americans, or white Americans. They don't see their country honestly. At least I don't think they do. They see it through this lens of... They don't look at it and say, well, yeah, we committed a particular genocide. We put a race in slavery for all of this time. They got no compensation for doing that. And they were beat and abused and raped throughout the entire process. In addition to kneecapping them every step of the way in their goal for trying to get a certain level of freedom, emancipation, or some kind of equality in that particular society. Now, a person who's taking all of that in context looks at that in a particular way and understands the social dynamics that's going on right now. Well, I don't think that's the case. They don't necessarily look at it that way. It's saying, okay, we need to do something to balance the scale. That's off the table. I have no point of view that thinks that they're going to do that. And again, because these people don't look at history with a full level of context, they think to themselves, well, look, I don't want to do anything else for anybody else. We did enough. We did enough. We let them go. They can do whatever they want. That's the context of the individual you're talking about. So when you're having a conversation and just trying to get that guy, that particular guy, that cynical guy who believes we've done enough, America's done awesome, we're perfectly okay. These are the same people who went into a country, killed 1 million Iraqis, and within a few years was like, yeah, we've done enough for Iraq. We've done enough for Iraq. I have no idea at all, or no belief, that those particular people with those particular values and think that particular way are in any way going to go for something that's based in identity. They're going to see it as, they're not going to care. Empathy is not the Republican strong suit. Meaning those people who voted for Trump, that's not their strong suit. They're not going to identify with you. The question becomes, do you need them to identify with you? Do you need them to? Can they just be who they are? Can I just be who I am? Can you just be who you be? And we agree on issues that affect all of us. I don't need you to understand me. You don't need to understand this guy. Let's just vote in a way that helps all of us. If you can take identity off the table, I guarantee you're going to get a shitload more people than you can if you're having these ideological fights, or the way that you're coaxing your argument is coaxed them away in identity. You can make arguments about things. You can have conversations where you focus on the issue itself, and you focus on the issue in a way that it affects the whole. Your issue, your goal, is to get elected. If you know that using identity, even if you're right, that's what I'm trying to get across to you. Liberals have this thing sometimes where they think, well, this argument is perfectly correct. It is cosmically correct. God himself could not besmirch the logic that I've just put out. That doesn't win arguments. That doesn't win arguments. Whether you realize it or not, that doesn't win arguments. And when I'm saying winning arguments is changing the mind of the individual who you're talking to. That mind is already set. That mind changes through experience, not the things that you're telling him. So yes, you can have this fight that goes in race, identity, and everything else, but you can never win that argument. The argument that you can win is the hard numbers of economics. And once you get in that office, you can make certain decisions to affect those things that you care about from an identity standpoint. But you don't need to yell identity at the top of your lungs in every particular situation. Yes, focus on economics, Sanders. Bill Maher is right.
And so the critics then use that against him by saying, oh my goodness, you're practicing identity politics. But here's the problem with that. Anytime that phrase is used, it's always used if you're not talking about white people. But the reality is, identity politics also includes white people. We saw that during this election. Anytime you heard working class, they were not talking about black people. Whenever you hear somebody say, ooh, the working class in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and the steel mills, they were not talking about us. They didn't show us. It was always aggrieved whites who said, oh my God, we're looking at all these things that are happening for black people, for Latinos and others. Let me also help you out with something. Shortly after the election, Thomas Edsel with the New York Times wrote a piece where he talked about this whole notion of white voters and how they view the issue of politics. They broke down some poll data after the Reagan Revolution in 1984. They went to Macomb County, Michigan. They went to all of these places in the Midwest, these Rust Belt states. But you also see the heartland, the flyover states. What they're actually saying is places where black people don't live. And here's what he said in 1984. They went in and the folks there said, the Democrats have done too much for black people. Y'all, this is in 1984. But take it back about 20 years. The exact same thing was said in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement. And you know what? We're good. Y'all have done enough for them. What about us? In fact, let me take it further. If you go back to the period of Reconstruction, the 12 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, after 244 years of slavery, after about 5 or 6 years, whites said in America, you know what? We've pretty much done enough. We're tired of this Reconstruction stuff. After the 13th Amendment was passed, after the 14th Amendment was passed, after the 15th Amendment was passed, and all of a sudden it began to wane. When the Reconstruction ended, the Great Compromise of 1877. And guess what happened? Federal troops pulled out of the 3 southern states. That's when Jim Crow began. So we've always had this period in our history where whites have said, all right, y'all got enough. But remember, President Barack Obama, just 1 year or 2 years into his term, CBS did a poll, asked the Tea Party their thoughts. 25% of them said he's done way too much for black people. I'm sorry, I was still looking for what he did for black people in the first year or two. See, so what you have to understand is, anytime you hear this phrase, oh, too much identity politics, what they're saying is, look, stop talking about black stuff. Stop talking about criminal justice reform and mass incarceration. Stop talking about income inequality, because we white people are suffering so much. But here's the deal. When you hear that phrase again, focus on the economy. Focus on the working class. Well, are we not included? When Donald Trump talked about saving jobs of Carrier in Indiana, did you realize that 50% of the people who worked at that particular plant in Indiana were African American? No, you didn't know that, because see, that was called saving working class jobs. But if you talk about the fact that African Americans have $5,000 when it comes to wealth, and the average white family has $110,000 in wealth, that's called identity politics. Well, check this out. When Senator Bernie Sanders was on a particular panel after the election, he was talking about it can't just be vote for me because I'm a woman, vote because I'm Latina or I'm black, which is all true. But this is what he said, quote, in other words, one of the struggles that you're going to be seeing in the Democratic Party is whether we go beyond identity politics. See, here's the problem. Senator Bernie Sanders has identified identity politics as saying, vote for me because I'm black. He's ignoring the issue. See, he wants to focus on class. You can't deal with class unless you deal with race. Because if you ignore race in class, then all you're doing is talking to white folks and not talking about black people. And so Bill Maher is the same way. But let me help y'all out who saw this coming. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Go back and read his book, Chaos or Community, Where Do We Go From Here? He said in that book, written in 1967, which was his worst-selling book in his life, and America didn't want to read that book. He said it didn't cost America much to allow us to go to hotels and to swim in swimming pools and to go to parks and to sit in restaurants. He said, now America has to write that check. And he said, you know what? Guess who will abandon us? Our white allies. He said our white allies will say, okay, y'all have gotten enough. Yes, the same Dr. King who folks have used as a bobblehead when it comes to his birthday in Black History Month said that. See, so it's no shock that a Bob Beckel or Bill Maher or Senator Bernie Sanders would have this particular view.
I have to be honest. I don't understand what this has to do with the price of tea in China. I understand Martin Luther King saying those people turn their back on him when they drop the ball. I get it. And Martin Luther King is probably right. But what does that have to do with Sanders and Bill Maher talking about jobs and the economy? Like, I don't see the connection. I think in his mind he's looking at it as when they're saying they don't want to have to talk about identity, they don't want to talk about race. That's not what they're saying. God damn it, that's not what they're saying. They're saying there are other issues that affect a larger number of people. You don't necessarily need to force people to think a particular way. And if you don't force them to think a particular way, you can form a party around core ideas. Now, yes, the people in that particular group are going to be free, and they're going to be all sorts of people, because the thing they're focused on is class, not race. Identity puts it back into race. Economics puts it into class. And you have 99% of the population that will back your ass up on this conversation of class. In race, you're talking about a subset of issues that you slice off the community. They're not going to care about the issues that you're talking about with race. They're not going to care that a black man was shot in the back by a cop. They're not going to care when cops are harassing and beating the shit out of people. They're not going to care. They're going to be completely unempathetic to that. You know what they worry about? Healthcare. I kind of want healthcare for my kid and my family. Hey, I kind of want college for my kid when it gets older. I want more money in my paycheck. Those are the things that they care about. Empathy is not on that list. Self-interest is. I'm not saying take your eye off the ball on those things. I'm saying that you acquire power so you can affect those things. Your means to acquire that power is an economic message. I understand that you want to be pure in regards to getting this stuff across in regards to like African Americans and other gender demographics. But how do you affect those changes? And how do you convince people that what you're saying is of value to them? Now, I take it as a value, and I think you're right. But what about the other people who don't? Those millions of people out there. You need those people in your camp. If you're going to focus so heavily on identity that you're going to alienate those people, you're losing allies. And you're missing the actual major picture. Our socioeconomic system is more important than almost all those issues that you've mentioned. There is no such thing as freedom in a capitalistic system if you do not have capital. The cash, the money that you have in your pocket defines your range of movement and freedom in that particular community. If you do not have any cash, you're going to go broke, hungry, you're going to starve to death. Functionally, you need that money. That money is your lifeline. So what I'm getting at is, in that particular situation, those people are united in that task. All of them. All of us. Every last one of us. The overwhelming majority of the country is with you in a sense. Meaning, yes, there's some true believers who believe the Republican line. But if you're forming a party and you're getting all this racial element out of the party between the Democrats and Republicans. Because understand what took place. In the Civil Rights Movement, Democrats jumped onto the Democratic side. Republicans, the racist ones, jumped into the other party. Right off the bat, you have a problem. You created a dichotomy in that particular society. Now, Democrats did it for a right reason. Republicans, not so much. And they used this idea of race and reparations. Democrats, or like I said, America doesn't necessarily have an honest vision of itself in its head. They didn't give those slaves anything for building this country. Now, in the same way after Iraq, they said, oh, Iraq is good. It's a few years. Yes, we killed 1 million people. Yes, we destroyed the entire country, but they're good now. They'll be okay. Well, they did the same thing with African Americans when they chopped them off. Having this conversation of reparations pervades a lot of this Republican talk to some degree. So Republicans can say, hey, those Democrats are trying to take your money and give those people those services. Now, the reality of the situation is Republicans and whites use welfare far more than any other demographic. They're hurting themselves, but they're using the argument of those people want reparations. Those people are trying to get stuff back. They're trying to take your tax money to give those people services and help. That's a potent argument for people who looked at America in a particular way and looked at it as they've gotten enough, they've gone far enough. You got to understand, those people are not going to see your side of things. They're not. They're not going to see your side of things. They're never going to see your side of things. The only bridge that you have to that guy, the only bridge, is cash. It's socioeconomics. And the socioeconomic system itself is more important than a lot of the stuff, because ultimately, that's the thing that allows you ranges of freedom in that particular society. Who cares if the guy hates you if you can be who you need to be? You're unencumbered. The issue becomes if those things become factors of law. But even then, you're battling in a sense of law, and it's for everybody. I need to get out this thing. Yes, I know there are different demographics and there are different fractions, but I'm trying to get this thing of all of us are one if you're talking about class. And we can come to conclusions in regards to what we want to do and where we want to go. When they poll people, Republicans, Democrats, all people in general, people have somewhat of a progressive viewpoint, meaning the policies and stuff that you're implementing would be somewhat progressive because of the people you're putting in office. If you're focusing on these cultural identity issues, you already divide that slice. Now, you don't have all these people who are slightly progressive on many of these issues that can move the ball forward. Now, what you have is somebody who dislikes and alienated because of something that you said. They also feel somewhat alienated because of the way the parties break down in regards to race. A new party destroys that. A new party removes these racial issues that's associated with it. And if that new party is focused on cash, you get a hell of a lot more bang for your buck than focusing on identity. I'm not saying leave these issues alone in the sense of cops murdering innocent people or structural things that are somewhat racist in the way those things pursue themselves. I'm not saying leave those things alone. I'm not even saying forget those things. I'm saying that those aren't the vehicles, however, to get you in office. Economics is.
The reality is this here. If you're Bill Maher and you're saying, okay, ease up on identity politics, Bill, let me remind you of something. Who voted at a higher rate than any group in America in 2008? Black women. Who voted at a higher rate in 2012 than any group in America, Bill? Black women. Who is the base of the Democratic Party? Black people. Who is the emerging secondary base of the Democratic Party? Hispanic/Latino.
Yes, blacks vote in a defensive way. We vote in a defensive way, and that's a problem. That's an absolute problem. If you're voting 90% for a Democrat, you've given up every last ounce of your power to that party, completely untethered from anything that they're going to do in that sense. Meaning you gave your vote not because you were hopeful in the sense. You gave your vote because you were terrified of the other goblin on the other side. You voted 90%. I understand the cultural relevance, but you need to break out of that. You need to break out of that. God damn it, you need to break out of that. Voting for Hillary Clinton at 90% is amazing. It's amazing. It's absolutely embarrassing. Why the hell would you vote for that woman in those quantities? I understand that Donald Trump is a goddamn goblin, but her record is atrocious. The things that she was doing abroad in regards to military, if you're talking about Libya, you're talking about the planes for Syria. You had Obama gave 95% of the wealth to the top 1%, and you honestly believe that Hillary Clinton was going to be somehow different. Even those drug laws that they were putting in, or the laws itself, they were putting in high concentration of people in prison. Those were your family members that they were putting in prison. The gutting of Medicare or social services in this country, of welfare, that affected you also. Yes, it affected whites, but yes, it also affected you. These things were almost punitive in the way they were being implemented. So she runs, has no platform whatsoever in regards to why she's running, and you vote for her to the degree of 90%. That's amazing. That's amazing. That's problematic. You give your power away. If you're voting 90% for a party and you have no context or no control of that particular party's apparatus, that is embarrassing. That is embarrassing. Your vote is your vote. It's not perfunctory. If they're putting somebody up, I don't give a shit who's on the other side. You need to hold your particular candidate accountable. Don't vote for that guy if he's going to behave a particular way. You give him a no, and you let his ass fail miserably. That's the only way you get people that you want, or that's the only way you articulate your power in that political process. By voting that way, you give it away. If you need to vote third party, vote third party. If you need to not vote at all because of people who they put on the ballot, then not vote at all. That is your vote at that point. And abstain. If they're fearful that you're not going to vote for them, that is where your power is asserted. 90% of a vote is an amazing thing. And that woman didn't do a goddamn thing to deserve it.
My advice to you is not to ignore those folks. Because if you do, if you start saying, oh, identity politics is irrelevant, then you're going to tick off those very African American and Hispanic millennials who will not vote in the next election. But also, let me say this here. I need folks like Bill Maher to stop playing the game, because there's a thing called white identity politics. And we have seen it. I have been telling y'all since 2009 that we are living in the age of white minority resistance. Even though this election, 70% of the electorate was made up of whites, Even though we saw that, there's a belief in this country that whites are being attacked. We're losing our rights. But that's not what's going on here. What's going on here is America is changing. By 2044, no one group will be a majority in this country. Whites will make up 47% of the majority in this country. What you have to understand is that's the real fear. The real fear is that African Americans have been going to college. Black women go to college more than anybody else in this country. The real fear is you're seeing the economic gains of Latinos at the expense of somebody else. Well, let me give you another history example. 1940s, there was a fierce race war in Detroit. You know why? Because Ford Motor Company and the other companies were looking to hire black people. White workers did not want to see African Americans getting those jobs. You had a fierce race war in Detroit as well as in Chicago over the issue of housing, public housing. What you have to understand, folks, is that when you see all of these attacks on identity politics, and what Bill Maher says, hey, focus on the majority, what they're actually saying is stop talking about police abuse. Stop talking about police reform, because focus on my job.
It's not what they're saying. What are you talking about? Dude, you need to take your decoder back to the shop. You need to take it back to the shop. If I'm saying talk about police brutality, yes, we should talk about police brutality. What are you going to do about it? Is that going to be the issue you're running on to get into office? Are you running on police brutality to get into office? You think those unempathetic assholes that's in the other side of the room who's looking at you is going to give a shit about police abuses because in their head, it's only your problem. Yes, police abuse them too, but again, in their head, their reality, their false vision of this country, that only affects you. They're not going to care. They're not going to care. I'm not saying get rid of the issue. Yes, the issue is goddamn important. I'm saying that you can't affect that issue until you get into office. The conversation we're having is about what is an effective tool to get you into political power to affect those things. You can scream about it all day. How do you get to the levels of power to do something about it? I'm making a point to you that you get to those levers through economics, not identity. It's not identity. You're going to get those people on your side, those Republicans. Many of these guys are just tribal. They're following and towing a particular line, supporting a particular policy because a particular politician put it out. They tend to fall in line. They're Republicans. The moment that you create something new, or the moment that that changes in regards to the candidate who's putting up, if they float based on that economic message, their values will also change just based upon the candidate who's being put up. I'm saying your best bet, your best interest into getting those people on your side is, yes, to talk about all the people. We're in it together. This is an integrated community. It's not the situation of this just affecting one and not the other. It's affecting everybody. So yes, the conversation you need to have is all. They're not going to understand this context of, well, wait a minute, this may need a little bit more help, or this is somewhat racist, this is a problem. Yes, all those things are true. And yes, all those things need to be addressed. I'm just making the case in this very specific case. The goal is to get elected. That's the point. And if that's the point, how do you get elected? What is the thing that you talk about that gets the most people standing in front of you, clapping their hands, giving you applause? We're going to do free healthcare. We're going to allow people to go to school without burdens from debt. We're going to get rid of that debt. We're going to get your wages high. We're going to have a green energy revolution to get more people into this solar energy process, or this natural energy process. We're going to fundamentally change how we do business in this country, and we're going to tilt it of fairness in regards to each individual. That's a specific conversation that you're going to have, and you're going to get a hell of a lot more people. And the moment that you bring identity into that conversation, those people fall away. Focus on the economics. You can change their value system when you get in office because you can address these things. But those things cannot be your platform. That's all I'm saying. These issues are important. Yes, I absolutely get it. You don't necessarily want to take the ball off those things. I absolutely get it. But it's not fair to say that if they're talking about all, they're just talking about whites. I don't think that's fair at all. But Bernie Sanders was chained to a black woman in one of those photos when he was doing a protest. I have a hard time believing that when he's having a conversation, he's purely thinking, I just mean white people here. That's something you pull out firmly out of your cheeks. That's a big one. Yeah, dude, I understand what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. I just disagree. I totally disagree. I think Bill Maher and Bernie Sanders are right. If you're having the conversation about identity, you're having a divisive conversation. And you need to take into account people being unempathetic, people not giving a shit, people having their own ideas, people having a false vision of this particular country, people not even having context on how devastating and damaging it is to have cops functioning in the capacity of sadistic assholes. I get it. So I do get it. But what's the apparatus to change that? What is the apparatus to change it? And do those people who are unempathetic and don't particularly care, do you think they'll come to your side and you think they'll bitch about it if your particular candidate was functioning and putting more money in their pockets? Or do you think they'll be a little bit more receptive because they voted for that guy based on economics? I'm saying you get your agenda accomplished better by focusing on economics than focusing on wedge issues. And I get it. It shouldn't be a wedge issue. Cop murdered somebody. Yeah, that shouldn't be a wedge issue. This guy is going to prison longer because of his race. That shouldn't be a wedge issue. But you focus on those issues after the fact. Yes, when those things come up, you say something about it. You firm on your particular position. You are strong and advocate for yourself. I get it. Yes, that's true. You should always do that. But when you're opening your mouth and you're screaming in a microphone, you should be screaming in a microphone about stuff that unites us. Economics. Economics. There is a ruling elite and we're going to go after their ass. That's the conversation you want to have. The majority of this population is pretty progressive. Meaning if you got those people to actually vote and those people thought you were going to do what you wanted to do, this country would be fundamentally different. When you ask people, what is the ideal? What do you think this is? Oftentimes their portrayals are vastly off. They vastly underestimate how much wealth has accrued at the top. Now, whether you're white, black, anybody else, you want to take care of your family. You want to live. You want to survive. And I agree with Roland Martin on this thing of identity, where they're kind of fading away in that sense, where they feel like they're losing their country. That's fair. All of these demographics are relative to one another. So, yeah, of course. But I get that. But again, this kind of goes back to this point that, so what if the guy doesn't like you? So what? I mean, yeah, you're going to have some people who vote against their self-interest. You've always had that voting in the Republican Party, and I would argue the Democratic Party. But that guy will be receptive to the economic message. That's all I'm getting at. Those people, all of those people could be different, but they will be receptive to that very specific economic message. Identity just doesn't get you there at all. It's getting you into conversations. It's getting you into people's subjective beliefs of their reality and what this country is and what this country did and how this country persists itself. Well, those things are different. There's a real reality there, but those things are subjective based on the people and the things they want to believe about their country and themselves. There's no way to break through that. That's not a logic process. That's not a logic process. That's some kind of subjective thing. But trying to break through that is not where you're going to go. So, alright guys, if you enjoy the content, feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support the work through Patreon.